Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers. I'm the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today's is a really cool task that we got going on. So, our task for today is the prisoner's dilemma. Now, the prisoner's dilemma was made actually quite some time ago. It's a relatively old task, and it was made as a part of game theory. Now, the purpose of the prisoner's dilemma, or the initial research question that they proposed whenever they made the task, was to see whether or not participants would knowingly not cooperate with another individual, even when the cooperation of them with the other individual would result in a better performance or better net gain. So they kind of proposed this task. Now it, in a sense, kind of turned itself into like the canon of psychology or classic psychology studies. I think most Psych 101 students know about this one just because it's really cool sounding and it's, kind of cooperative risk reward sort of task. So I'm actually really excited to make this one today. Now, what we've done is we're not only including the prisoner's dilemma in today's task or in today's live stream because it's a little boring. It's not too much, too big of a task. It requires, really one slide object, an inline object, and an outcome, which that's way too easy. So to spice things up a little bit, what we've also included is a questionnaire for the Big Five. So the Big Five personality traits. We're also going to be including that as a first part of it. Now, this is roughly based off of a 2009 study that I found online, where they used the Big Five factor scale as a predictor of whether or not participants are more or less likely to cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma condition, prisoner's dilemma task. So we're actually kind of semi-replicating that study today. So it'll be pretty cool. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So if you notice today, I'm using ePrime 3 as always. It is called an ePrime 3 webinar, hence the ePrime 3. So, and I'm just starting with a blank experiment template here, and I do this every webinar just to make sure that we're making these things from scratch. Now, I usually say this about midway, but I'll make sure I say it right away. If you guys like the task and would like to see a finished version of it, if you're not following along today and just want to get straight to the good stuff at the end, after the webinar today, I am going to be uploading this onto our experiment library along with this video. So, you'll have the task there and then exactly how I made it. And if you are running this in our embedded, our little embedded window there, and the task is actually right below me, congratulations, you found both. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and make a welcome screen. Just a very simple screen welcoming participants to the task and letting them know a little bit more about what they're going to be doing first. Now, the first thing they're going to be doing in our task is actually going to be the Big Five scale. So I'm going to go ahead and in my session proc here, just go ahead and double click on it to open it in the Experiment Explorer window. I'm going to take a slide object and just drag it and drop it into the session proc here. I'm going to go ahead and rename this one just to Welcome. Now, I'm renaming this one to Welcome because, I like the name to follow the function. This is the object that will be welcoming participants to the task, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, there's going to be a couple of really cool parts to this that a few parts that I haven't shown off in a live stream yet, and a few parts that I have, but I'm going to kind of double down on them. And one of the things I'm doubling down on in this task is I'm making it completely touchscreen compatible. I've done that, I think, in one other webinar before, one other live stream before, but I'm really going to hit that touchscreen compatibility aspect. Now, the purpose of the welcome screen is literally just text. So I could technically have a text display object, and that would technically be the most efficient object for me to use for this part of the experiment. However, I'm using this welcome screen because I want participants to be able to click a next button on the screen, just so this can be presented, because it's kind of a gamey, kind of fun little task. You can present this on a touch screen, like a Windows Surface or anything like that, and just show people very quick and have them run through this task quickly. Makes it a little more portable. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the welcome object to open it here, and I'm just going to go ahead and add a slide text sub object, because I am in fact going to be displaying text to participants. Now, the text display object is a little small at first. This isn't the size I need. So instead of going into the properties and resizing it using percentages, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here. So I'll make the text roughly this big. It's really not going to be that much text though. And I'll just type a very simple welcome message. So welcome to the task. I'll say you will first be asked a few questions about yourself. And I'll make sure it's a few questions and not a few question. It's kind of silly. It says, please answer them as quickly and honestly as possible using your mouse or touchscreen. That's the one thing I did want to point out, especially with these instructions. Just because we're making this task touchscreen compatible doesn't mean you can't run it on a normal computer with a non-touchscreen monitor. Since it's touchscreen, we are going to have the mouse cursor, and I'll make sure that the mouse cursor is available to participants and visible, and I'll show you how to do that. But once we make that available, participants can actually just use the mouse to click on the next buttons as well. So this will either be a task that's completely performed with a touchscreen or with a mouse. We're excluding the keyboard at this point. I'll just say, press next to begin. All right, so let's go ahead and center this on the screen just a little bit. And you notice when I clicked off of that slide text sub object, all of my text kind of smushed together. That's not how it's going to display whenever you run this object. In fact, if I double click on it, you'll see all that spacing that I had before. This is more what it's going to look like whenever I run the task. For design time, this is just a little trick that you need to keep in mind. If I actually just put a whole bunch of enters in here and then click away from it, you notice it smushes together as well. To see what it'll look like more at runtime, go ahead and double click on that slide text sub object. Just a little trick to keep in mind that this is how the slide's going to actually look instead of something like this where it's all squished. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to add a next button to my object. So I'm going to go ahead and take a slide button sub object from the toolbar here, put it in the bottom right hand corner. I kind of want this next button to stay consistent throughout all of my task. And I'm going to go ahead and change a few properties about this button. So let's go ahead and click on the slide sub object properties page. Now, firstly, this is named button 1. Not particularly descriptive. I want to make it something a little better than that. So I'm going to go ahead and call this one next. Now, if you notice, as I was typing up here, you notice there's a line down here under response that happens to change. If you look here, it says responses reported by the slide button sub object or slide button object shall report next for the rest property. So now I know whenever I look at my data file under welcome.resp or welcome.response, if I so choose to log that, I'm going to see any press to this button show up in my data file as the word next in curly brackets like that. I do have the option to change it so it doesn't reflect the name, and I want to say something like continue. That doesn't impact the name of the button object or how I would reference it in Inline Script or anything like that, but what it does change is how it looks in my response property. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that so my name matches that RESP value. I'm going to make sure the frame is the same, but the one thing I do want to change here is the theme, because right now it just says button, and I have them click something called the next button, so let's go ahead and make that. So in the theme tab here, I want to go over to the text tab. Right now, just the general tab lets you change kind of the style of the button, some of its general properties, whether or not it has a border, those types of things. But if I click on text, I can actually change the text of what shows up on the button. I just want to change it from button to next. Now notice whenever I type this, it shows up in bold. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to show up bold here, because if you look here at the bottom of their font, it says bold no. The reason it's showing up in bold is because it's letting you know that this differs from what the slide theme is, or the default values of the slide theme. If you want to know a little bit more about the slide theme and how that all interacts, definitely check out the webinar I had made on it. It should be available on YouTube as well. It's just called ePrime New Features, and I have an entire one. I think it's an hour long devoted to the button object. So trust me, we get into detail with those. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and call this one next. Click apply, and you see that little button change to the word next. And we should be good. So what I want to do before I go ahead and move off of this welcome object is change the properties of the object itself, because while I did do a lot to change this next button, I didn't do anything to the slide object. So let's go ahead and click on the properties page icon in the top left hand corner. Click on that duration tab, and let's set the duration to infinite, change data logging here to standard, and I'm going to add a button input mask. Now I'm going to set the allowable here, or keep the allowable set to curly brackets with that little wildcard symbol in there. Now, that wildcard symbol there just means any click on any button is going to advance this slide object. And I know that because I have my button object here as my input device. Now, I know that I had said that, we'll be responding with a touch screen or a mouse. That doesn't mean that I have to also add a mouse button as my input device here. All that means is that this button and the press of the button, either through a touchscreen or through a mouse object, is what's going to advance this object. So even though we can possibly respond to this button object with a mouse, we don't need a mouse input mask, because the input mask itself is going to be the button object. So that's all we need to change on here. So let's go ahead and click apply and OK to save those changes, and we'll go ahead and move on. Yep, so that's all I need there. So after my welcome screen, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a block list. Now my block list is going to be just a little more exciting than it was in some of my other live streams. Because before, all it was just, it was going straight into the block proc, and then I had my trial proc underneath, and that was the exciting thing. Since I have 2 tasks in this experiment, this block list is actually going to be pretty cool. So it's what's going to determine the order in which our tasks are presented. Now, the first task is obviously going to be the big 5 factor scale, and the other task is going to be the prisoner's dilemma task. So we'll go ahead and click on session proc right here, and we'll take our list object and put it just after welcome. This list object is how we're going to determine the difference between when these objects are shown. Now, the way that I'm going to set it up is that the big 5 factor scale is always going to show up first, and then the prisoner's dilemma task will show up second. However, if you want to counterbalance that, I'll show you how to do that as well. So we'll go ahead and rename this one from list 1 to block list. And then go ahead and double click on it here. Now in block list, I just want 2 trials here. I want one procedure that's my big 5 factor scale, and I want one procedure that's going to handle the prisoner's dilemma task. So I'm going to click on this add level button so that there are 2 levels just in preparation for both of them. And under my procedure here, I'll just put big 5 scale proc. So just BFS proc, just for big 5 scale, or BF scale proc. It says it doesn't exist, but I like to create it. I'm going to click yes. Would I like to make this a default value for newly created levels? I'm going to say no because we only have 2 levels of this object. So I'll go ahead and double click on this. So then my other procedure here is just going to be prisoners proc. Doesn't exist, but I like to create it, of course. So now the entirety of my big 5 scale is going to be held in this procedure, and the entirety of my prisoner's dilemma task is going to be in this procedure. And this block list controls the order at which they're being presented. Right now, it's currently set to sequential, which means we're always going to do the big 5, then the prisoner's procedure. However, if we click on this properties page up here and click on this selection tab, I can actually change the order from sequential to whatever I want. So if I want my program to randomly, for some participants, display the big 5 scale first, or some participants get big 5 scale second, I can have it set to random. Now keep in mind this will in fact be random, so you might end up with one condition favoring the other. If you'd like, you can set it to counterbalance, which is going to make sure that it is, evenly dividing it between participants, and it'll actually do that by what you enter for the subject. So all even subject ID participants are going to receive the big 5 scale followed by prisoner's dilemma. All odd numbered, or sorry, the other way around. All odd numbered are going to receive big 5 scale followed by prisoner's dilemma. All even numbered will receive the prisoner's dilemma followed by the big 5 scale. We're going to go ahead and keep this to sequential though, just because that's how the sample will be. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK to save that change. And that's all we need to do in that block list. So let's really dive into that big 5 factor scale then. So we're going to double click on it here, and the first thing we're going to do is actually make a list object that contains all of our questions. Now this is going to be the part, and I'm going to close all these windows just to clean things up here. Get out of there. All right, now this is the part that's actually going to be a little bit unique to some of these webinars. I actually haven't shown this off yet, but it's a pretty cool feature of ePrime. I'm going to take a list object, and I'm going to put it as the first object in the big 5 scale proc. And I'm going to rename this one. And this is just going to be that big 5 question list. Now, what I could do, and what I've been kind of avoiding on some other webinars, is sitting there and typing out a massive list object for everybody. Second. My apologies. Getting a little sick. All right, so what I could do is sit here and I could write out an entire list for people. Now there are 60 questions I'm going to present to participants, and I could sit here and type all 60 of those questions. However, that's going to be boring. It's not going to be an exciting and engaging webinar. So let me show you what I've done. I'm first going to go ahead and save this, because saving is actually really important. And I'm going to save it in this folder called Prisoner's Dilemma. Now if you see I already have a finished version of the task in there, I'm just going to call this one Prisoner's Dilemma Live Stream. There we go. Now, if I go ahead and open up that folder here, you see I have my livestream.es3 file in there. I also have this text display object called Big 5 List. I'm going to go ahead and double click on it to open it. I'm going to show you guys what I have here. Now this is actually just a tab delimited text file or .txt file that already has all of my questions and all of my different factors that I need for this scale already in here. So if you look here, I have a column here on the very far left here called weight, and I'm setting all of my weight to all of these questions for one. I have my nested. Now those are obviously set to blank. I have a procedure in there already called BFAS trial proc. Then I have my BFAS question. So these are the questions for the big 5-factor scale here. My scale type, and these are all right now set to just the different types of scales. So I have the neuroticism measure. I have, just all of the big 5-factor scales, openness, intelligence, those types of things. So I have all of those just to let me know exactly what scale I'm looking at right now. And I have my reverse score. So is this being reverse scored? Because there are some questions on there that actually are reverse scored just for, consistency's sake, to make sure participants aren't just like hitting the 6 key or the 5 key, anything like that. So this is actually going to be really helpful, because what I'm going to do is, instead of typing all of this information out or even copying and pasting it into my list, I'm just going to have ePrime read from this .txt file and fill in all of those attributes up here and fill in all of this information in the list object for me. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this just for a second, and I am going to go ahead and make this procedure. Now, I just closed out of it, but I'll keep it open. The procedure that I'm referencing in here is BFAS trial proc. So let's go ahead and make that procedure here, because I'm going to need something to work with whenever I make my objects. But what I'm going to do now is, instead of filling out the rest of this object, what I'm going to do is click on this properties page icon here. And right now, load method is set to embedded, which means that it's actually looking at ePrime and this list object for information that it's going to get. So right now it's only going to get the fact that there's a procedure on there. But I want to feed it all of those questions that I already wrote down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this load method from embedded to file, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this little folder button. Now what the folder button does is it defaults to wherever I saved this .es3 file, and this is why saving it was so important before showing this off, because now my text file is this big 5 list, and if I double click on it, click apply and OK, so it now says all samples from file, 1 cycle equals all samples in file, and I'm running them at sequential selection. So now ePrime is actually going to look in this list object, and it's going to get all of the information that it needs from this list object. And that's exactly what I want here, so I don't have to sit there and type everything out. Now keep in mind that this looks a little messy because it is a tab delimited text file, and some of these sentences are really, really, really long. But if this were loaded into like an Excel file, for example, you can really see these columns are really lined up well. So if you are making a tab delimited .txt file for ePrime to read in, we recommend doing it in Excel just to make sure your columns are stable. Your columns are exactly what we need. Now keep in mind, whenever I load this from file, it actually stops me from editing anything in here. Like I'm typing on the keyboard now. I know you can't tell, but I'm typing on the keyboard now. I can't even change the procedure because it's going to get all of that information from this big 5 list text display object, or text object. Now the only change I want to make is right now it's set to take everything from this list or this text object and make it or sample it with sequential selection. I don't necessarily want that, because if you notice, like all of my neuroticism questions are all in the same place. And all of my intelligence questions are all next to each other. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and click on the properties page here and go to selection, and we'll just set this to random. So even though I am getting those values from a text file, I can still tell ePrime how to sample them. So these will be random or sampled randomly. All right, so that actually is it for the list object. I now don't really need anything else because I have it all in this file. And keep in mind, this file will be available as well. It's going to be a part of the example that I have in the experiment library. So if you want to take a look at how I did that, it's a pretty good example of how to load these files into ePrime. All right, so now I have my BFAS trial proc. Now I know I just closed that text file, but we're going to need it open in just a second. But the first thing I want in here, and it's going to be pretty simple, is it's actually just going to be a slide object to present the question and have participants answer it. And I'm just going to call this one BFAS answer. And that just stands for Big 5 Analog Scale Answer. There we go. So I'm going to double click on this to open it. And what I want is I actually want a Likert type scale at the bottom of the screen here. I want them to be able to select their answer from one of 5 possible options, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with neutral in the middle. And then I want a next button. So I want them to have to click on whichever one they want, and then I want the next button to be clicked on afterwards. So I could sit there and try to format this slide exactly how I want, but fortunately in ePrime 3, we have these really nice slide layout templates. Now if I click on the drop down here for slide layout template, I just pick on what I want. And I think I'm going to want right here. This is a rating scale choice. This looks most like a Likert type scale. It is a 5-point all labels text prompt, which is exactly the type of scale that I need. So I want my 5 points, all labels, so I can label each and every one of those points, so it's explicitly stated what they each do. And my prompt is in fact just going to be text on the screen. So go ahead and click on it. It says, are you sure you want to insert the slide layout template? I'm going to go ahead and click yes. And then after a second, it should pop up. There we go. It says slide layout template applied to your experiment, and I click OK. Now, I've shown these off before in past live streams, but I really like the fact that what it does is not only does it make the screen look nice, but if I go ahead and hop into my duration input tab, already formats it for me. I even have my next button there, and it shows up as next exactly the way I like it. So I don't even need to edit any of the properties in here. They are all done for me. And if you look in the general tab, you'll notice that the ACC, RT, and response for this are the results of choice 1 and not the next button. So that's even exactly how I want my data to look. So I'm done editing the properties of this. All I need to do is just edit what it looks like. So survey header, we'll keep the survey header on, and I'll just call this Big 5 scale. If you really want to keep this, that's completely fine. It's not necessarily going to be in the final version of this, but you know, if you want this on here, you can keep it. I'm going to go ahead and delete question instruction because we already gave them instructions in the welcome, and the instructions aren't too terribly difficult. But I'm going to go ahead and stretch this question prompt to be a little larger on the screen because some of my questions are quite long. I'm going to delete the word question prompt, and I'm actually going to reference an attribute in my Big 5 list text object. And this one is just called BFAS question. So we'll go ahead and make an attribute reference here. Now, for those of you who are familiar with attrib sense, note that since we're only defining that attribute in that text object, you don't actually see it in attrib sense because it's in that text file. There we go. BFAS question. Now, the other thing to keep in mind too is that while text displays are really nice and they're really easy to kind of load into your experiment this way, especially if you've already had that cross-section of variables in here, and it makes the design part on ePrime a little easier, it makes troubleshooting a little harder. So, for example, if I like make a typo here and just call it, BFAS question, but forget the E in question or something like that, I have to then check this location to make sure I spelled it right. Then I have to check my text file to make sure that I spelled it right as well. It just introduces another step into troubleshooting issues. So it's definitely something that I would do under certain circumstances. There are a few circumstances under which we actually recommend loading in this .txt file instead of loading in, actually embedding everything. Mostly it has to do with very constrained randomization though. But for the most part, just know that it does introduce another layer to your troubleshooting if anything goes wrong. And then now that I have my Big 5 scale and my question presented, I just need to change these items here because right now it just says item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's not descriptive for participants. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and rename this. So I clicked on, and I did that pretty quick, I'm sorry. I clicked on the choice object, and then I clicked on the sub-object properties page at the top of the screen here. Now what I want to change is I want to change the label because I want to keep the value the same because I'm actually going to be referencing the value and using it to kind of get participants' score under each one of the categories of the Big 5 scale. So I'm going to change my label here, and my first item is just going to be strongly disagree. And if I go ahead and click OK, and then click out of this, you'll see that now that item, or now that particular choice changes from item 1 to strongly disagree. And we'll go ahead and click on this button here, and let's go ahead and change this here just to disagree. And my next one will be neutral, then agree, and then finally strongly agree. Click apply one more time and click out of there. Now I have my scale exactly the way I want it. Now I do want to mention a very particular property about the slide choice sub object. And that's in here, this default value. Now default value can be literally whatever you want. If it's blank, you'll notice that nothing on this object is checked. This is actually going to affect your response if participants decide to just click next, 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 and never answer any of these questions at all. And this is something that you really need to keep into consideration when you're making a scale like this. If you have nothing selected and the participant clicks next, what's going to happen is it's just going to move on, and your response for this object is going to be blank. However, if I set this default value to anything, and obviously my scale only goes from 1 to 5, so that's the only thing that makes sense in the context of this experiment. But let's say I set it to 3, for example, and I want the neutral box to be checked by default. If the participant just starts spamming the next button, what'll happen is in your data file, it's going to look like that's how they responded to this object because it's already checked. So that's something that you need to check for you, and it's going to actually affect how the data file looks, and it's going to affect some of the functions in the experiment as well. So what I'm going to do, just to simplify things, is I'm actually going to have neutral selected by default. So then even if the participant doesn't respond, and if I click apply and OK, you can actually see that neutral is now selected by default. Even if the participant doesn't respond, it's going to show up as a response of 3. And we're going to start to see that in the data file when it looks like they responded 3 to every single trial. So it'll be very easy to pick out once I take a look at the data file, but I'm still going to get a number. And that number is actually what's going to be the most important thing here. Because if you take a look here at my properties page, the thing that's actually going to print out to my data file is not whether or not participants clicked strongly agree, disagree, neutral, agree, or disagree, those types of things. It's actually going to be printing out my value column. So I'm going to get a number from 1 to 5 for each and every one of these questions. And that's also going to be important for the next thing that we do, is make an inline object. And that inline object is going to be the crucial part of this, and that's why we need numbers here. So now that we have our scale and everything's all set up, let's go ahead and make that inline object. Because what I want now is I want some sort of printout of what participants are, strongest in. So is, for example, the agreeableness part of the scale. So this A here, these A questions, is that what participants are strongest in? Are they strongest in conscientiousness? What are they high in? What are they low in? You have to get that type of readout because that's the kind of data that you're looking for. And what I could do is I could manually check it every single time and look at every single one of the responses to this BFA answer object and make my own notes, or I can just make ePrime do it for me. And that's what I want to do here. If you want to make a response mandatory, so we had a really great question come in. Somebody said, what if you want to make a response mandatory before clicking next? That is an awesome question. Now, the way that we do that is we actually have a great sample that kind of shows off this. What you would need to do is you'd need to actually make a script task event. Now, script task events is something that I cover really kind of heavily in another one of my, actually 2 of my other live streams, so I recommend checking those out. But what we can do is we can actually make this slide button sub-object inactive. We can make it so it could show up as gray. We can make it so it doesn't even show up at all until participants click on this button here. Now, the scripting for it's a little more complicated than I have time to go in the remaining half an hour of this live stream. But we have a really great sample of it if you want to get it from us. So just go to support.pstnet.com. That is our product service and support page. Say, hey, I want this script for how to make this a clickable button, or how to force a response on this scale before I make that clickable button, and we'll absolutely give that to you. So that's definitely something that you have available. Otherwise, if you go into your, and I'm just going to plug this real quick. If you go into your samples for ePrime here, and let's go into Documents, My Experiments, Samples. Actually, we'll go to ePrime 3 here. You go to ePrime 3 and go to Samples. We actually have a script task event sample, which is going to be an excellent starting point for programming this into your experiment. So what this does is it actually makes buttons unclickable after a certain amount of time. So you just kind of need to reverse the script there. But that'll be an excellent starting point if you're doing this on your own. But that was an awesome question. Keep those questions up. I love getting these types of questions during live streams. All right, so in the inline object, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and first I'm going to rename this inline object so it's actually descriptive. And I'm just going to call this one Calc Big 5. Now, there's really a couple of factors that are going to go into this inline object. The first one is this column here in my .txt file and its scale type, because I want ePrime to be parsing these responses based on the type of scale that's being shown. Now, the scale type is obviously going to be one of the different factors in the Big 5. So, for example, I want all of the neuroticism questions to be the neuroticism, answers to be answered all together, and I want, the conscientiousness ones. I want the agreeableness ones. I want all of those to kind of, be paired together. And I don't really want to compare people's, neuroticism against their agreeableness until I have a final score for each. So what I want to do is I want to make what I call, or what is called, not just me, the world calls them, a select case statement. So what this is like is it's going to be a really big if-then statement that's going to handle a couple of factors. So I'm going to do select case. And now the case that I'm selecting is going to be this column in my text file called scale type. E prime is going to read this in as an attribute. So I just do c.getAttrib. And then I get the attribute value for scale type. Now, if I look in here, there's actually a couple of options that I have for my case. And I just pull this up. First one is scale type N for neuroticism. So I do case N. And I'm just going to write out all of my cases right now and then fill them in with some very simple if-then statements. So I have my neuroticism. I have my agreeableness. All right. And then I have conscientiousness. And then after that, I have my E scale. There we go. I believe this is empathy. I'm kind of spacing on the E scale right now. Sorry about that. I have intelligence. Oops, and I'll make sure I close that one out. And after intelligence, I have openness. Case O. All right, so what this is going to do is this is actually going to tell me the type of question being presented to participants. And it looks like I actually have my insert button on. There we go. So it's going to tell me the type of question being presented to participants whenever I actually show the different questions at the scale. And I just type and select right there to end my select case statement. And I can go ahead and just hit enter to all of these here, just to give me a little bit more room, because what I'm going to add in here is now I'm going to add something to take a look at this column up here, so reverse score. And there's actually two conditions. There's going to be reverse score equal yes and reverse score equal to no. So reverse score equal to no, if they rate high on, let's say, the neuroticism scale, they're going to say, I strongly disagree, or I strongly agree, which means I'm high in neuroticism. I'm going to answer with strongly agree, which is going to end up being a 5. However, if it's reversed of this, then answering or clicking a value of 1 means that they're high on the neuroticism end of the scale. So what I want to do is I just want to flip these numbers, basically. So to do that, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make an if-then statement. So I'm going to say if c.getAttrib, and I'm going to be getting the value of my reverse score attribute, which is in this text object here. Oops, type that. There we go, my reverse score attribute. So if reverse score is equal to, and the only one I really care about is yes. If it's equal to no, then it's going to kind of be the way that it is. But I am going to start with that one. So I'll just say no. Then. Now what I want to do here is I actually want to make a couple of variables that I haven't made yet that actually stand for each scale type. So I want N, A, C, E, and I. And I want to actually have these as variables that they're just going to count up how high they are or how low they are in each and every one of these traits. Now, I want these to be referenced at almost every single part of the experiment because they're going to be a really big factor, a really big contributing factor here. So I'm going to go ahead into the user script here, and I'm just going to make a very simple few variables. So let's say dim, and I'm just going to go into my calculate 5 here, and I'll just call this N scale as long, and these are just going to be long type variables. So I'm just going to actually do these for all of my big 5. So I have A, C, E, and A, C, E, I, and O. So dim A scale, dim E scale, dim I scale, and dim O scale. There we go. So now I have these variables that are going to hold the values of all of my scales here. So I'm going to hop back into my Calc 5 here, and then I have if the reverse scoring equals no, then I'm going to say that N scale is equal to N scale plus, and then it's just going to be the response to the BFAS answer dot response. Now, the one thing I need to do quickly is I need to actually change the way that this works, because right now I have just the BFAS answer dot response, but responses in ePrime are always logged as strings, and you can't actually add strings together. They just do something called concatenating, which is just adding them next to each other. So if I go ahead and run the experiment now, this line's actually going to throw an error for me. So what I need to do to fix this is all I have to do is just change this. I have to do something called casting. So I have to take this answer scale, and I'm going to get rid of it real quick. And it's going to just be CLNG here, which is going to be casting it as a long. Because if you notice, my end scale data type here in my user script is long, so this also has to be a long object, so I can add both of them together. So I'm going to paste those. So C long, and then that's at BFAS answer scale.resp. Now usually I can do end if, but I have my condition if the reverse score is equal to yes. So I do else if, and I'm just going to copy this part here. No sense in typing it all out again. So if this reverse score instead of no is equal to yes. And of course I have my overwrite there. So if the reverse score is equal to yes, I'm going to have to do a little bit more. Now in this case, I need to actually reverse the scoring of all of my answers then. So I'll do, and I just have this in very simple inline. So if BFAS answer dot resp is equal to 1, and all I want to do is just flip it. Then end scale is equal to end scale plus 5. There we go. And I'll just do else if. And all I want to do is just modify this to be every other possible response. So instead of my response of 1, all I need here is my response of 2. Then this equals 4. And paste that one more time. If participant responds with instead of 2, then 3, then this one's obviously going to be 3. Oh, and I forgot to copy that else if statement, so we'll go ahead and put that in there as well. There we go. All right, and then let's copy the rest of this just for 2 and for 1. 1, 2, 3, so this is 4. And that's an answer of 2. And then one more time here. Oops, sorry, that's a 5. And that equals 1. There we go. So that's really all we have to do then to apply that reverse scoring. So now we're going to actually get a better readout of whether or not they're high or low in each and every one of these scales. So instead of having to sit there and type all of these out, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this entire chunk of script here, and after A, I'm just going to paste it. And then all I have to do is I just have to change this N, whoops, this N to an A. In each and every one of these. So this having this, the reason why I put that insert state on the keyboard there is I can just then really easily change that. There we go. So now I have my A scale already figured out. So if the answer is 1, then my A scale is going to be A scale plus 5, and so on and so on. And we'll do the same thing to the rest of them here. So this one's my C scale, and we'll just go through here. Make sure that we're not overwriting any of the wrong scales. Oops. We go, and then just 3 more here. So this is the E scale, Now this is all going to be really important a little bit later then, because what we're going to do after I make all of these changes here is we're actually going to make an inline object that prints a single value out for each and every one of these scales. And that's actually going to help us a lot later when we do our data analysis, because it'll show us which one of these scales we are highest and lowest in. And, on top of that, we also do get this question a lot in support is, hey, I have these reverse score scales. How do I make sure that they all equal one number in the end? This is exactly how you would do something like that. And it's just a very little simple bit of inline script. Now, keep in mind, it's going to look like a lot of inline script when you're all done with it. But I mean, if you notice, the only thing I'm changing is every other line, and I'm only changing literally one letter on every other line. So, the amount of script that this is going to look like versus how much effort I'm actually putting into making this script is pretty low. Go scale. And there we go. So that is all the inline script I need. Now, keep in mind, if you were to go ahead and have this BFAS answer have no default value here, you would have to then wrap all of this in a gigantic inline or gigantic if-then statement. That's, if they respond to answer, then do these calculations. Otherwise, you're going to end up getting type mismatch errors for all of these. But since we did set a default value here, this script is completely fine because participants can't actually get into here without, at minimum, the neutral being selected. So that's really all we do, or all we need to do. Now we have our big 5 scale already set up. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. I'm going to generate it first. What this is going to do is it's going to check for syntax errors if I happen to misspell anything. So it looks like I did. So it says encountered case selecting else if. So that means that there's something a little bit wrong with the way that I set this up here. And the way that I happen to set this up is, let's see here. Yep, so it looks like I need one more end if statement here. Whoops, I have my caps lock on. There we go. So now I have 2 end if statements, one for this gigantic reverse scoring one and one for all of these. So I'm actually going to go ahead and indent these so these are all on the same line. There we go. So now I have my big if then statement and I have my small if then statement. I'll just do the same thing here. There we go. Very easy fix to this. And we'll go ahead and regenerate. Again, checking for any syntax errors. I may have misspelled something. Variable not defined. So let's take a look here. What was this line at? So in case you do this like what I did and just kind of click away from it, what you can do is you can actually hop back into what it is and then go ahead and go to this output window, and it'll say at the bottom here, it says variable not defined. It says error occurred at line 42 of the inline name calc big 5. So I go to line 42. I take a look at here. It says this is not defined, so I don't have C-scale defined anywhere. And C-scale would be defined on my user script, and I hop in here, and I don't have C-scale. So just dim C-scale as long. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and click generate one more time. Yep, and if you look there, I actually ended up misspelling one of them. There, so now my C-scale. Make sure that's all correct there. Generate one more time. And at this point, it's literally just catching all of my little spelling errors. And I'm sure if you're following along at home, you watched me make those errors and didn't say anything, so shame on you. Take one more last look. All right, go ahead and generate one more time. And my script compiled. So what that means is it doesn't mean that my script is completely correct, although I'm pretty sure it is. What it means is that there are no syntax errors in my script. So now that I have all that set up, let's go ahead and close all these windows and hop into our prisoner's dilemma task. So this one's actually going to be a lot easier. So for our prisoner's proc, what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 sets of instructions here. I'm going to go ahead and make my instructions using a slide object. And the first one's just going to be called task instructions. And I'll go ahead and double click on this to open it. Now, my task instructions are going to basically just be, hey, this is the task. It's going to be kind of telling the story of the prisoner's dilemma. And then what I'm going to be doing after my task instructions is I'm going to actually be setting up all of the outputs or all the payouts in another slide object, just so participants know exactly what the outcomes are going to be for each and every one of their selections. So what I did was I made a slide text sub-object and just put it there, and I stretched it to the entire width, so I have plenty of room to type. And I'll go ahead and type some very basic task instructions. So I'll put thank you for answering those questions. Those questions. There we go. All right, so I'll read what I have so far. So thank you very much for answering those questions. In this task, both you and your partner have both committed a crime. Actually, just say, get rid of the first both, just so it makes more grammatic sense. So you and your partner both committed a crime and have been caught by the police. You and your partner made a pact to remain silent when interrogated by the police. So I'll keep going with the instructions here. All right. So it is entirely up to you to decide to honor that pact or not. Your partner has the exact same choice. The potential outcomes are shown on the next page. Click next to see them. So I'm going to go ahead and make this more the center of the screen, because if you notice the text was kind of running off the top there, not ideal. So I'm going to go ahead and make this more center, and I'm going to go ahead and make a next button. So what I can do is I can add that and change all of the properties again, or I'm going to go ahead and delete this slide button sub-object quickly. And I'm going to go into my welcome screen, find my next button, and just hit Control-C to copy, hop into my task instructions, and hit Control-C to paste. And what that's going to do is that's going to paste that button in the exact same location. And that's actually a really helpful thing if you want that button to remain consistent on the page. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into these properties page here. I'm going to keep my duration input, or my general tab, the same, go into duration input, keep this on screen for an infinite duration, change my data logging here to time audit only, and I'm going to add a button keyboard mask, or button input mask, sorry, with my allowable set to the same. So go ahead and click apply and OK to save those changes. Now keep in mind that some of my text looks like it's a little cut off there. Whenever I run the task, you'll see all the text. All right, so now that I have my task instructions, let's have another one to describe the payout of each of the tasks, or each of the choices. So this one's just going to be called something very similar. It's just going to be called payout instructions. Again, just trying to make these as descriptive as possible, so whenever I look at my data file, I'm like, oh, that's what it is. And also, if it looks like participants aren't quite getting the task, then I can see how long they were looking at the payout instructions, and I can be like, oh, they didn't read this long enough. So I'm going to stretch this to the entire width of the screen there. And let's go ahead and change the text here. So this one's going to be a little bit more involved, because I am talking about all of the payouts of this task. So I'll say, other person. And there we go. That blame the other person. You both serve a 5-year prison term. If you both decide to remain silent, which is the cooperation condition, right, so these are kind of the two basic ones. If you and your partner decide to blame the other person, you both serve 5 years in prison. If you both decide to remain silent, which is kind of cooperating on your pact that you had agreed on earlier, then you both only serve a shortened 1 year prison term. Now this is where things get a little interesting. So if you remain silent, but your partner blames you, you serve 20 years in prison while your partner gets off completely free. However, the inverse of that is true. So if you blame your partner and your partner remains silent, then he or she serves 20 extra years in prison. Yeah, 20 years. All right, so that's just some very simple instructions. If you blame your partner and your partner remains silent, you're free to go and your partner serves 20 years in prison. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and close out of this very quickly. It looks like I ran into something of one of those little bugs in ePrime. It happens just to be a little memory leak that we have that sometimes pops up. What you would show up on the screen very quickly was just a little warning letting me know about that. So, I mean, basically, this is just kind of a save frequently and save often kind of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and force ePrime to close out here. Just going to go ahead and close it. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and open this Prisoner's Dilemma live stream again. I shouldn't have lost too much. It should actually be pretty easy. Easy to keep going from here. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to keep going straight from the point of, hey, I'm in the middle of editing that text display object after those instructions, and we'll just go ahead and make the actual prisoner's procedure. If you're following along at home, just, feel free to, we're literally just picking up from where we left off. All right, so now that we have those instructions and we have all of our totals laid out, the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to take a list object and I'm going to put it in the procedure. Now, keep in mind, if you were following along, there would be two slide objects right here. The first one is just going to be called task instructions. And the next one here is going to be called payout instructions. There we go. And now we're going to rename this new list. This one's just going to be called prisoner trial list. There we go. And we'll double click on it to open it. So now, the structure of the task should look exactly the same. All right, so for our prisoner trial list, what we're going to do is we're going to actually have a weight here of 10. And the reason I'm going to weight this for 10 is I want participants to run through this task 10 times. So to do that, you just go ahead and set the weight to 10 there, and I'm going to keep this at sequential selection because there's only going to be this row. Now I'm going to make a nested list here, and it's going to be all of the choices that the Confederate has, or the supposed other participant, the accomplice in this crime. So I'm going to actually call this one Confederate list. And it says it doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. So now I have this Confederate list in there, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Now my procedure, however, is just going to be called prisoner proc. Prisoner trial proc. There we go. I don't want to repeat what I have here. It says it doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Of course I would. Would I like to make it a default value? Sure. I'm not making any more levels. This is actually all we need for this prisoner's trial list. So let's go ahead and hop into this Confederate list. And what I want to do is I want to actually make choices for the Confederate here. And there's obviously going to be two. So I'm going to go ahead and make an attribute here. And my attribute is just going to be called Confederate Response. And there's actually two possibilities. The participant or the Confederate could either choose to confess or remain silent. Now, right now, it's going to run this in sequential selection. And this is the part that's actually really important to get right, because I want participants to feel like there's another person actually making this choice, and I want the choice to almost seem random. Now, to make that random, I could go ahead and change this. I am actually going to change my selection method to random here. Now, what that's going to do is, since I only have really 1 degree of freedom here, the participant will then confess and then will remain silent, then confess, then remain silent. And that's really not what we want there because it doesn't look random. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the weight of this one to 100, and I'm going to change the weight of the other one to 100. So now there are 200 samples, both 100 confess and 100 silent, and E prime is going to randomly select from them. Now, since I'm only running 10 trials, E prime is only going to randomly select 10 of these possible 200 samples of either silent or confess. And that's going to make it a much more random sample, and it's going to seem like a little, it'll seem a little more random what the Confederate chooses to do. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of all of those windows there. Go ahead and double click on my prisoner trial proc quickly. And then now that I have my prisoner trial proc open, what I'm going to do is the first thing I'm going to do is just make a slide object called prisoner's task. So I'm going to go ahead and add that slide object. I'm going to rename this one to prisoner's task. There we go. And prisoner's task is actually just going to be very, very simple. Now the point of this one is actually I'm just going to show participants just a very simple text object, just kind of like consolidation of the task itself. So I'll make this text display object. I'll put it at the very top here and stretch it out. And I'm just going to say, do you remain silent or blame your partner when interrogated about a crime that you both committed? All right, so just a very simple slide text sub-object at the top that literally just boils everything down to a choice. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to have two button objects here. I'm going to choose to either remain silent or to blame my partner. So I'm going to stretch these out a little bit just so they seem, just so they're a little bigger, because I'm going to need to put a little bit more text on each one of these. Now I want these to be exactly the same size, so I can actually use this in E prime to kind of line them all up. I'll put this one over here, and let's go ahead and change this. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to call this left one here. This is going to be my blame partner condition. So I'm just going to call this one confess. And then I'll go ahead and hop into my theme here, and I'll just in my text here, I'll type blame partner. Now, me calling this confess is actually going to be really, really important later. And if you remember, it actually lines up with one of the options for the Confederate list, and that's going to be pretty important for later too. So I'll go ahead, and I actually didn't add a space in between blame and partner, which looks a little weird when reading it out loud. So I will go ahead and put that space there. So I have blame partner. And then I'm going to call this one silent. And then in my theme here, I'm going to change my text just to remain silent. There. So now participants have one very simple option of two very easy button objects on the screen. They can respond either using a mouse or a touchscreen. I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page icon up here. My input source will remain my input mask because I'm going to go into my duration input tab, and I'm going to add a button input mask, and my allowable is just going to be the same. So I'll click on any button on the screen, and I really only want one click. I'm going to change my duration here to infinite, change my data logging to standard because I want to actually log the click as well, and just click apply and OK. And that's all I need to do for this task. It's actually really, really easy. All right, so in my prisoner's task here, what I want to do is double click on this, and I want to make just a very simple inline object after here, and it's just going to be called calculate outcome. There we go. And what I'm going to do in my calculate outcome is I'm actually just going to say, hey, if it's going to look a lot like my calc big 5 object. It's actually just going to calculate whether or not I remain silent or the participant remains silent and what the Confederate did. So what I want to do is I want to make another select case statement. So I'm going to structure this exactly like my calc big 5. So select case and then just seed. This is actually just going to be prisoner's task response. That response. And I have two options. So my first one is case silent. in case confess. Because if you, hold on, I'll do end select. There we go. So if you think back to the options that I have here, I can either choose the confess or the remain silent. So these are the two possible responses I'm going to get here, are either silent or confess. And now all I need to do is compare this to what the Confederate may be doing. So this is actually just going to be a very simple if-then statement. So I have if c.getAttrib, and this is actually just that Confederate response, equals silent. I just look in there, make sure that's correct. Yep, they either confess or silent. And I'm just going to make the, I'm going to make this right now and just set the value of an attribute. So this is just going to be c.setAttrib, and I'm just going to call this one outcome. And in this case, if I'm silent and the participants or the Confederate silent, I'm just going to call this one both silent. And then I have else. And then I'll just make this one a little bit more verbose. I can technically do an else if statement, but since there's only other one case, but I'll actually type this one out. So I have else if Confederate response equals confess. Then get a trib or set a trib there, and I'm just going to set the attribute of outcome. In this one, I'm just going to do silent confess. I'm going to call them that way. This is just my naming scheme that makes sense to me. You can have your naming scheme however you want, but I'm doing silent confess because the participant chose to be silent and the Confederate chose to confess. And this is what's going to end up in me in 20 years of prison. And then let's just do the very same thing here for this one. So if c.getAttrib Confederate response is equal to silent, then I'm going to set the value of this outcome here. So in this case, I chose to confess, or the participant chose to confess, and the Confederate chose to remain silent. So I'm going to call this one confess silent, and we'll come out with the outcomes later. And I have else if. There we go. And I'm going to actually copy this line here. So if Confederate response was confessed, that means we both confessed. Then I'm going to set my outcome over here. And I'm going to set that one just to both confess. And then I'm going to do an end if statement right there. So that's actually all I need there for my inline script. Now I'm actually going to use this outcome attribute that I had made to set up one part of my outcome, or of my outcome slide object that I make. So I'm going to hop back into my prisoner's trial proc, and I've done this really quickly, so I'll go through this a little slower. I'll make my, go into my prisoner's trial proc here, and I'll make a slide object at the very end here. And I'm going to rename this one just to the outcome. This can be called whatever you want. It may even be called something different in the final version of this task, but for now we'll just call it the outcome. And now what I want to do is I want just some very simple text on the screen. One way to do that would just be in this calculate outcome here. I can just make an attribute reference that just has different slide text on it. But what I want to do instead is I want to go ahead and play with some slide states, which is something that hasn't happened too terribly often in these live streams either. So the first slide state that I have here is actually called state 1. But I want to name those slide states in line with this outcome attribute. So I'm going to have one here called both silent. So I'm going to change my state 1 here to both silent. There we go. So I have my both silent here, and I will go ahead and just have a very simple text display object on the screen. Make that a little bigger, make sure it's a little centered, and I'll just say, you have both chosen to remain silent. You both serve 1 year in prison. And let me make sure that's correct based on the task instructions there. I just want to make sure that I actually have the payoffs right, or this whole thing doesn't really work. Yeah, so if you both remain silent, you both serve a 1 year shortened prison term. So that's exactly what I need. Now, I want to make a slide state for every possible outcome. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, instead of clicking on add slide state, I'm going to click on clone slide state. Now what that does is it makes an identical slide state next to it, and it just calls it both silent too. And if I go ahead and rename this, I'll just call this one both confess. And then all I have to do now is go ahead and delete the text that I have here. So you both chosen to remain silent. And I'll just say you have both blamed the other person. You both serve 5 years in prison. I'm going to go ahead and save this very quickly. Now I want to clone the slide state one more time, because the reason I'm doing this instead of making a whole new one is I want where this text shows up to remain consistent despite the slide state. So this one I'm going to call silent confess. And that one lines up here with my calculate outcome, where I chose to remain silent, the participant chose to remain silent while the Confederate confessed. And I'll just type that out. So say, you remained silent, your partner, while your partner blamed you. You serve 20 years. Whoops. 20 years in prison. Your partner goes free. And then I obviously just need one more. This is going to be my confess silent. So just click on that clone slide state button, and this is going to be confess silent. There you go. And then I'll just say, you blamed your partner remained silent. You go free while your partner serves 20 years in prison. And there we go. So now I have all of my text set up for all of my different slide states. So now I just need ePrime to reference these correctly. To do that, go ahead and click on this properties page icon, click on the display or this active state name right here. And right now it's set to always show both silent. But if I change this to outcome, an attribute reference to that attribute that I made in calculate outcome, it's actually going to change slide state based on the participant's response and the different condition. I'm going to keep my duration input here. I want to keep this on screen for, let's say, 2,000 milliseconds, and I'll change my data logging here to time audit only. I don't necessarily want participants to have to respond to this, but I want it to be long enough that they read the outcome. And click OK here, and I'll save the task one more time. And that's really all I need to do here. So it's a very simple task, this prisoner's task. Now I noticed up here for my my big 5, I had done a really good job of getting all of these scales here, and this is the last edit I want to make, but I didn't actually save any of this information anywhere. So I just have a very simple other inline object to make. So if you noticed in my big 5 calculation scale, and this is something that I totally overlooked, I'm actually saving all of these scales. So C scale, A scale, those types of things. I'm getting all of that data. All I want to do is I just want to have one very easy attribute that's output at the very end of my task that just says what participants were rated highest in. So what I want to do is add an inline object just after my BF question list. And I'll go back into my BF scale proc here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to rename this one just to final big 5. Because this is what's going to end up being, the entirety of my scale here. And I want to just set some attributes so that my data file has these values. So let's use c.setAttrib. And the attribute that I'm going to do, it just has to do with each of the levels of the scale. So I'll call this one neuroticism. And this one's just going to equal my N score. Oops. Then I'll do the same thing, c.setAttrib. And this one's going to be agreeableness. And that one's my A score. Finally, I have, or not finally, but next I have conscientiousness. And that one's going to be my C score. So now in my data file, I'm just going to have a final output number for each and every one of these calculated answers. And this one's going to be extroversion. I was totally wrong with that one earlier. That's going to be my E score. I think I called that empathy earlier. That is entirely my fault. So after extroversion, I have openness. I have my O score. And after openness, I have intellect. And that's going to be my I score. So now I can very easily and very quickly see all of the final values for all of my scores in my data file. So now I have my entire task set up exactly the way I want. So we're going to end all of our live streams the way that I end all of the other ones and just add a goodbye slide at the end. So I'm going to take a slide object, add it just after my block list. Go ahead and rename this to goodbye. Open this up here. And I'm just going to take a slide text sub object and I'm just going to have a very simple goodbye message. Just thank you very much. Completing this task. Please let the researcher know you are done. And there we go. That is all you need to do to make a big 5-factor scale and a prisoner's dilemma task all in one. Like I said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to host this on our experiment library if you want to check that out a little later, or if you want to look at it while you're watching this video just to see what I had done. Otherwise, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them to support.pstnet.com. If you want, you can even mention me by name. Say, hey, I watched Devon build this task. Devon, can you help out? I'm always happy to help out. Otherwise, thank you guys very much. As always, please feel free to hit that like and subscribe button on the YouTube page. Definitely helps us out on the business end of things. So, not that I like to, ask for those kinds of things, but I do definitely appreciate it. And yeah, if you have any suggestions for future webinars or future live streams, I'm actually making a task on Thursday that a user had asked me for. So that's going to be a really cool one as well. So please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, thank you guys very much for attending today's live stream. Hope you have a great day.